Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the National Museum, United States Navy. I'm David Barker. I'm one of the educators here. I would like to today introduce Pam Overman. She is a curator at Navy Art Collection here at the museum, well actually at Navy History and Heritage Command. She's been here since 2007. She's presented several exhibits here in the museum. She works as a loan manager and assists the Navy and the public in questions about the collection. Personally, she's interested in nuclear history, taking her places as varied as Frenchman Flats, Nevada, Hiroshima, Japan, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Ladies and gentlemen, Pam Overman.
Thank you, David. As he said, my name is Pam Overman, and I'm a curator with the Navy Art Collection. Today's brown bag brief will focus on the artwork and the artists the Navy sent to witness Operation Crossroads, the atomic test performed at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. Illustrated in vivid color, these watercolors and paintings bring the viewers as close as possible to this important event. Operation Crossroads detonated the 4th and 5th atomic bombs, this time exclusively for testing purposes at Bikini Atoll, a remote island, part of the Marshall Island chain in the Pacific Ocean, just over 3,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. Just 1 year earlier, on 16 July 1945, near Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first bomb fell into the desert to determine if these new weapons operated as expected. The next 2 bombs were dropped from airplanes in battle on Hiroshima, Japan on 6 August and Nagasaki, Japan on 9 August, bringing World War II to a close. As the atomic age began, many questions regarding the consequences of this new weapon came forward, as well as which branch of the military would take the lead. To solve these mysteries, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, with presidential approval, created Joint Task Force 1 on 10 January 1946. Each participant of the Joint Task Force sought a different outcome from these tests. For civilian scientists, they pursued definitive information as to the powers of these new weapons. For the Army Air Forces, they looked to prove that they should have the lead in using these weapons in the future. And for the Navy, they wanted to show that the ships and equipment that helped to win World War II were not rendered obsolete by this new weapon and could survive an atomic blast. Originally, 3 bombs were to be tested. The first, called Able, as a low-altitude atmospheric test. The second, called Baker, a shallow underwater test. And lastly, Charlie, a deep underwater test. However, Charlie was canceled due to concerns about radiation after the second test. Joint Task Force 1 assembled a large contingent of ships, aircraft, military personnel, and materials for the test. This included a large target fleet of over 90 vessels, including battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, small landing craft, and captured German and Japanese ships. These vessels were moored inside Bikini Atoll with precise measurements to record the damage sustained. The Navy also brought 150 support vessels to provide quarters, experimental stations, and workshops for most of the 42,000 personnel, of which 37,000 were Navy personnel. 3 of the men assigned to the project were Arthur Beaumont, Charles Bittinger, and Grant Powers. They used their skills as artists to create paintings in color, while most of the photography and film of that area were in black and white. In the upper right-hand corner is Lieutenant Commander Arthur Beaumont, U.S. Navy Reserve. He was known throughout the Navy as an artist of naval scenes and servicemen. He received his commission in 1932 and became an official artist of the Navy. After receiving his commission, Lieutenant Commander Beaumont was frequently called to active duty all over the world to record naval history through his paintings. In World War II, he served as an art correspondent and combat artist for the Department of Naval Information. By 1946, Admiral Chester Nimitz, by then CNO, selected him to be an official artist during Operation Crossroads. On the right-hand side, you see Charles Bittinger in his younger days, not in 1946. He was a camouflage artist that served in both World Wars. His work was undoubtedly a decisive factor in protecting numerous ships carrying the subtle gray tones of his color schemes. Between the war, Bittinger began experiments in the use of scientific findings in devising works of art. In 1937, he served as the artist for for National Geographic and the U.S. Naval Eclipse expedition to Canton Island. He too was selected to be an official artist by the U.S. Navy to witness and paint the explosions at the Bikini Atoll. And lastly, in the lower left-hand corner is Grant Powers, and he served with the U.S. Marine Corps, and when called upon, used his skills as an artist. During World War I, he served in France, moving equipment, and later with the map detachment to develop maps of famous battles such as Belle Woods. During World War II, he not only directed the recruiting efforts of the Marine Corps, but also served as a combat artist during the Battle of Iwo Jima and the occupation of Japan. He too was assigned to Joint Task Force 1 to cover the tests and to illustrate any publications related to the experiments. Why don't we start right at the top with Vice Admiral W.P.H. Blandy, and he was the officer in charge of Operation Crossroads. He served in distinction in both World War I and in World War II. Both the study on the left-hand side and the formal portrait was painted on his flagship, USS Mount McKinley. And going down the line, we have Rear Admiral William S. Parsons. He had been an ordnance expert for the Manhattan Project, as well as the weapons officer on board Enola Gay that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. He was one of the few Navy men at that time that had expertise with atomic weapons, and he served as the Deputy Task Force Commander for technical direction of Operation Crossroads. And now we will move on to the operation itself. So this operation required not only target ships, but as I stated, a large supporting fleet with numerous personnel to situate the ships in the atoll, prepare the various experiments on board the ships, set up equipment on these ships and on the island. The supporting fleet housed the workers, the guests, and eventually the press. This is basically sunset the day before the first the first bomb was to go off. The support fleet has evacuated, leaving the target fleet behind, full of darkened ships awaiting their fate the next morning. And as my intern said yesterday, it's hard to believe this is for Operation Crossroads because it really could look like the fleet nearly anywhere at any time with a beautiful sunset. Next. So this is another view of the target fleet. You may be asking yourself, boy, those ships look awfully close together. Is that really the way they looked in the atoll? And it is not. So the intelligence officers on Admiral Blandy's staff briefed the artist Arthur Beaumont on the variety of security issues that were involved. One of them was the positioning of all the ships. It was agreed that the artist could accurately portray the relative positions of each of the major vessels, but the distance between them would be foreshortened. That way, any analysis of the damage shown in the artwork would not reveal the true destructive capability of the bomb. As a result, the target fleet appears to be very close together. And you may notice the very bright orange battleship in the front. That is USS Nevada, and it was painted orange to assist the B-29 bomber crew that would be dropping the plane. That was their aim point, basically. And this is how the artist viewed those members of the ship's crew on deck watching the bomb supposedly go off. Eye protection from the able flash was a major concern. Approved darkened goggles were provided to personnel on ships 25 nautical miles or less from the able detonation, and to all observers on the press ships. All the observers on these ships, including the press and the foreign dignitaries. Men without goggles that were in 30 nautical miles were to turn away, look down at the deck, close their eyes, and cover their eyes with their arms. Now this may have been what they saw through their goggles. This is what the artist Grant Powers thought he saw when he was on board USS Appalachia, which was a press ship. And if I could have a quote from one of the other observation ships, from a yeoman who was on the USS Fall River. He said, quote, "They stressed that personnel not required to be below decks were to be at quarters topside, sitting down with their arms over their eyes and heads cradled between their legs. Even though we did that, we could still see the light from the bomb with our eyes closed. We had dignitaries aboard, and one of them had a stateroom on the starboard side near the XO's cabin. Right after the explosion, here was this gentleman calmly painting the cloud as it was forming." And here is one of those images of that first atomic cloud called Able. And this is captured at the peak of formation. This painting illustrates the classic mushroom cloud shape. The pink color of the cloud is due to the oxidization of nitrogen caused by high heat and radiation from the explosion. The rapidly cooling fireball is the cause of the red glow seen deep within the cloud. The blast wave created the massive waves and steam that engulfed the target fleet at the bottom. And we've been asked many times, is that really what the bomb looked like? And our answer is yes, that is what the artist viewed when he saw it, those reds and those pinks. And here's what Grant Powers thought he saw 1 second after that first test. You can see how the initial explosion and the blast wave collided with the surface of the lagoon and was reflected back upwards. This deformed the shape of the fireball, creating the skirt around the stem of the mushroom cloud. And this is how we pictured it 7 seconds after. The fireball is surrounded by bomb debris and water vapor begins to rise into the sky. At the same time, the blast wave moves out from the bottom at 180 miles per hour. And you can see our infamous USS Nevada on the left-hand side there. And then 3 seconds later, the bomb cloud has formed 4 distinct parts. At sea level, the blast wave has expanded horizontally, blasting through the anchored fleet at the bottom of the cloud. The stem and the mushroom cap have formed, with lingering remnants of an initial atomic reaction coloring the clouds. Lastly, in the background, a lingering condensation cloud has formed around the mushroom cap as a consequence of the high humidity levels at Bikini and within the Pacific Ocean islands. And at 4 seconds, the reaction within the cloud begins to wind down. The hot wind of the blast has arrived at the ship's station 15 miles away. And this is the very last stage of the Able bomb by Charles Bittinger. After the convection currents caused by the blast disrupted the winds in the upper atmosphere, the Able cloud lasted for about 20 minutes before the winds returned to tug and pull it apart. As the debris fell to the sea, the colors began to change with that of a more normal cloud. Now let's take a look at what the target fleet looked like after that first bomb. This is USS Arkansas following the Able test. As can be seen in this watercolor, the battleship suffered considerable damage to the masts and the deck from its atmospheric detonation. It was still afloat by the time the second test was formed, but it sank after that particular test. And here is an image of USS Lamson, DD-367, and it was moored about 600 feet away from ground zero. It suffered an explosion due to the force of the Able test and sank in the afternoon. Later investigations discovered that it was a blast wave that created a large wrinkle in the hull that caused the explosion and the sinking. And as we move on, this is a day later. This is a panoramic view of the fleet. Again, this is Arthur Bittinger actually on board USS Arkansas looking into the target fleet. As he looks, you can see, although it was supposed to be the main center point, the USS Nevada was actually missed by Army Air Forces and the bomb dropped not on the center point. So USS Nevada survived, a little scorched. You can also see the Japanese ship Nagato in the background and Sakawa in the foreground. And we'll see a better view of the sinking of the USS Sakawa here by Arthur Beaumont. You can see it sinking in frothy green waters the day after the Able test. Again, the orange battleship Nevada there in the center. And several days later, here is a view of a submarine that was part of the target fleet, USS Skate. It looked pretty bad after the Able test, with her masts and antenna hopelessly bent and her superstructure buckled and torn. Despite appearances, however, the pressure hull was intact and the boat able to maneuver under her own power. The ship was heavily contaminated by radiation after both bombs, and she survived both bombs, only to be brought back to the California coast for radiation study and eventually scuttled in 1948. With submarines, there's aircraft carriers after the first Able test. If the target fleet, if the ship survived the first blast, the ships were reconfigured for the second blast, which was to be an underwater test. So they are actually moving USS Independence to her new location for the second test. The ship was thoroughly battered and twisted, but it was towed to a shallower water for that second test. Believe it or not, the ship survived the second test as well, again to be towed to California for a study for the radiation that she sustained. Now we're going to move on to that second test, the Baker test, which was an underwater an underwater detonation. So this is how Charles Bittinger saw that second test. It's the underwater test. So when the hot gases from the explosion broke from the surface of the water, they instantly created a puffball of water vapor. It was created by water rushing into the space left behind by the fireball gases as they surged into the sky. And this is the cloud from the Baker bomb at its peak, showing the water column and the familiar cauliflower-shaped cloud of water vapor. Millions of gallons of water therefore hung in the atmosphere and were mixed with fission particles, and all of that became highly radioactive as it rained down on the target fleet. And this is the late stage of the Baker bomb as the cloud begins to dissipate and the cloud collapses. Again, it's raining millions of gallons of radioactive water over the fleet, basically contaminating everything that it touches. For several hours after this explosion, a fine, highly radioactive mist rained down over the entire area. So not only were the observers on stationary ships, they were also allowed to go up in aircraft, some of which were manned, some of which were unmanned. Grant Powers, I believe, was one that went up in a B-29 to view the second testing. So as you can see, again, the hot gases are moving outward to pull up that water column made up of millions of gallons of water. So these aircraft soares during the tests were used to collect scientific data and report back any information regarding the bombings. As this one you can see the ripple effects of the bomb. It's also basically going to create a huge tidal wave. And this is about 15 seconds after that second Baker bomb. The column of water begins to spill out of the top of the condensation cloud. The full formation of the Baker cloud only reached about 10,000 feet, significantly less than the first bomb. The blast column did reach to the floor of the lagoon, some 200 feet deep, and spewed bits and pieces of coral onto the decks of the target fleet. This is 25 seconds after that Baker bomb. It produced this particular underwater testing of the atomic bomb produced so many unusual phenomena that a conference was held 2 months later to discuss the implications, as well as define and standardize new terms. So this image you can kind of see the size of the cloud to the size of the small island. We'll move on to the after effects of the Baker bomb. This is the USS Pennsylvania, which survived both of the atomic tests at Bikini, which is a fitting testament to this particular battleship that had also been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The ship suffered only minor fire damage, but was so heavily contaminated by radiation after that second bomb that it was scuttled off Kalijua 1 in 1948. And this image shows the sinking of the USS aircraft carrier Saratoga. She basically sank because the crew were not allowed on board to do any damage control. It was so contaminated, so the ship eventually sank. As one of the most well-known aircraft carriers during World War II, this particular sinking was keenly felt by the officers and men of the Navy. And I talked about that tidal wave. That tidal wave moved all the way onto the atoll and onto what was remains of the villages on Bikini. And it was so powerful that it pushed some of the smaller landing craft onto the beach. This picture shows the damage done to one of those craft and how far it was pushed up onto the atoll. The blast basically caused so much radiation damage to Bikini that even after 75 years, the island is uninhabitable. So now I'm going to move on to perhaps how the artists were viewed on their time with the Navy to witness these operations. We have some letters written by the captain of the USS Fall River, which hosted the artists. And this is what he wrote to his wife right before the first atomic test. We have two other temporary additions to our mess. One is Arthur Beaumont, who is a noted maritime artist, works mostly in oil and watercolor. He is the successor to the late great Reuterdahl, who had been the Navy's official artist since the days of the Great White Fleet back in the time of Teddy Roosevelt. I am familiar with Beaumont's work, and it is good. The man himself has a widespread reputation in Navy messes, which have played host to him as a pain in the duff. He is 50-ish, with a clipped little mustache and a clipped British accent. He was born in England. He wears the leaves of lieutenant commander with a surcharged device that resembles a chamber pot. Perhaps it is. He sits above me at mess, I suppose out of deference to his distinguished reputation. The second character is an elderly, rather senile gentleman named Bittinger. He wears the uniform of a captain in the Navy. Sometimes he appears with no eagles, sometimes with only one, and sometimes with one or both pinned on upside down. He too is said to be a well-known artist and camouflage expert. I am perfectly willing to give due deference to the distinguished professional attainments of these gentlemen, but it annoys me to see them given rank. Later in this letter he states, "This morning I posted the letters for special A-day cancellations. Each officer and man was allowed but 5, so I sent one to each of you 4 and one to Jen. There's nothing inside, so don't expect a letter when you open it. Beaumont designed the cover for the Fall River envelopes. I think any cartoonist could have done a better job. He even has the stars of the Admiral's flag arranged horizontally, and this from the Navy's official artist. If my friendship with Beaumont continues to ripen at its present rate, I think I shall ask him to do a portrait of me. It will probably look like the picture of Dorian Gray at the zenith of his wicked life." This captain also writes to his wife after the Able test on July 8th, and he says, "My relations with Beaumont have improved somewhat. He is a stingy, egotistical little man, but quite harmless. He has a 6-week contract with the government, which is netting him $1,500, and in his spare time he is allowed to make as many sketches and paintings as he wants, which will no doubt fetch him a tidy sum when he gets back to his studio, in Hollywood of all places. He is a good artist, and it's fascinating to watch him work. He never sits down on the scene and makes a finished painting. He merely makes a pencil sketch, which takes about an hour, then comes back, sits down in a cool, shady spot, and aided by his phenomenal memory for detail and color, and perhaps a photograph of the scene, makes his finished painting. Does he throw away these sketches? Not on your life! He tells me that an artist's sketches are his bread and butter. When he accumulates a sufficient number of them, he tacks them up on his walls of his studio and throws a cocktail party for his well-heeled Hollywood friends, who came to look, admire, and buy. Little Arthur ain't giving nothing away." West, the Army officer on staff, asked him jokingly to do a pencil portrait of him. Beaumont looked him coldly in the eye and asked, "What price did you have in mind?" Now that you have that background, you can appreciate the payoff. When Joe Zimmer announced that the mess bill this month would be $35, everybody screamed in pain. Then it developed that the Admiral, who is determined that his reputation for open-handed hospitality must not suffer, had decreed that Arthur Beaumont and Captain Bittinger would be considered guests of the mess. That almost precipitated a mutiny. Bittinger went back to the Mount McKinley this morning, but Beaumont will be with us for another month, and how we love to pay for the bastard's keep. Bittinger at least did the Admiral in oils before he left, and we saw that painting earlier in the show. A letter from Captain Bryson to his wife on July 14th. "I've seen considerably more of Arthur Beaumont lately, and I find him not at all unlikable since I know his worst faults and discount them in advance. He is at least a man of the world, a very competent artist, and rather welcome company when I get too saturated with the company of my humorless messmates. He and Dave Crawford and I went on a shell hunting expedition over on Bikini Island yesterday, after which we dropped by and closed the club. Beaumont has done a watercolor of the Bikini Officers Club, which is very good. The place is full of tanned and hairy-legged men seated at tables and busily engaged in lapping the stuff up. That much is true in life, but a startling note is added by a blonde woman in a scanty two-piece red bathing suit, nonchalantly strolling down rows of tables. I accused Beaumont of seeing mirages while crazed with heat and thirst. He confessed that he had seen a nurse on the beach wearing such a bathing suit, and by a stretch of artistic license, that transplanted her to the club. If Beaumont's pictures are published by the Navy, as they probably will be, I certainly want to get a set of them. I've watched most of them take shape on his easel, and they seem alive to me. All of his works and the works related to Operation Crossroads seem alive to me as well. Thank you for your time. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
So, these artists that the Navy hired to paint these pictures, did any of them do what many people would consider fine art? Or did they just confine themselves to painting military scenes?
I'm sure that Arthur Beaumont would consider himself to be a fine artist. And I believe Bittinger had more of an illustrator's background than a fine artist background. And I believe we don't really have any biography information about Mr. Powers. And at that time, the Marine Corps really didn't have a formalized artist program, so I don't really have much information about him. But since there's not a lot of artwork that is out in the market, so to speak, I would say that probably would not be considered a fine artist. Personally, I don't care for that term because it's very subjective.
It's very subjective, yeah. And the other question I had was regarding photography of this event. Does the Navy have any photography in the collection?
Yeah.
Yes, quite a bit.
A lot, yeah.
Motion pictures, they have it from 6 different angles.
Oh,
This
okay.
event was so widely documented.
Yeah, it was very widely documented. They had film, they had still photography, they had it on the ships, they had it on the island, they had it from aircraft, they had it from all over the place. One of the problems with the first bomb being dropped with Able was it was supposed to drop over Nevada. The problem is that did not occur. The bomb dropped somewhere else, and it actually ruined a lot of equipment and photography and film because they missed it. They missed their target.
Yeah, I mean, the difference being the paintings are considered art, where photography was just documentation.
Yeah, and as I started, I mean, there's lots of photography, but most of that is in black and white, where, you know, like I said, Bittinger is painting in pinks and reds, and they're like, that can't be true. That is what he saw, so that is what he painted, and that is probably the color that it was.
And he did this from memory. He said so even the paintings of this is what it's like after 1 second, 2 seconds. And then watch the motion picture footage of these bombs, and that, yeah, it's incredibly accurate what he depicted.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they all had very good memories, and they probably did some sketching. Beaumont obviously did some sketching and some watercolor, and then the finished paintings. And obviously there was a time gap between the first April bomb and the Baker bomb. I believe something like 2.5 weeks. So they used that downtime to do painting as well. Any other questions for me? I hope you enjoyed yourselves, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.